Forget everything you've seen in the movies. Real pirates weren't looking for adventure. They were looking for justice. They created the world's first democracy where everyone was equal: white, black, fugitives, and mercenaries. And then they were hanged. Today, pirates, who really were these people? The history they didn't teach you in school. Feel free to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new episodes, and hit like if you're interested in finding out where the myth ends and the truth begins. Enjoy the journey. Chapter 1. When the sea became a road for gold. The sea knew no masters. It didn't listen to king's orders and didn't remember emperors' names. Every wave rose and fell on its own, reminding all who dared cross the ocean, there are no laws here except the wind. And that's exactly why one of the most remarkable pages of human history began here, the history of pirates. Long before black flags and cannon duels, the sea was already teeming with raiders. Even pharaohs complained about the sea peoples, tribes that suddenly attacked Egypt's coasts and vanished, as if dissolving into mist. This is the 13th century BCE, the first documented traces of piracy. Later, the Greeks gave them a name, pirates, one who takes risks. A pirate wasn't called a criminal, but a seeker of fortune. In the Odyssey, travelers were often asked, "Are you a merchant or a pirate?" And it didn't sound like an insult, but as recognition of courage. For the ancients, the sea was a road where you could lose everything, but also find more than you deserve. The first pirates were simply poor sailors. They had no country, but they had a ship. They knew the winds, knew where merchants hid, and knew that gold was weaker than a saber. At first, they weren't feared. They were part of trade, like risk in business today. But when raiders began attacking Roman ships, everything changed. In the 1st century BCE, the Mediterranean became an arena of chaos. Entire fleets of Cilician pirates controlled trade from Crete to Spain. They captured aristocrats, burned ports, sold slaves. Rome was paralyzed. One episode became legendary. Young Gaius Julius Caesar was captured by pirates who demanded 20 towns of silver for him. He laughed in their faces and said, "My name is worth no less than 50. They raised the ransom. Caesar spent a month among them. He read them poetry, played dice, promised he'd return and crucify every last one of them, and he returned with a fleet. He really did crucify the pirates. This episode became a symbol of how power first realized the sea must be subdued. Thus began Rome's anti-piracy campaigns, the first war on crime at a global level in history. But piracy didn't die. It simply sailed to where laws didn't reach. In North Africa, Barbary corsairs rose, descendants of ancient Phoenicians. They raided Christian ships, took captives, and sold them into slavery. These sea hunters became Europe's true nightmare, fast, silent, merciless. Their success forced powers to build escort fleets. In fact, it was pirates who forced states to maintain permanent naval forces. Without them, there would be no empires. Centuries passed. The sea became civilized, but only on maps. Everyone who sailed beyond the horizon line still remained alone with the abyss. In the 15th century, a new era began. Spain and Portugal opened the route to the New World. From America to Europe flowed gold, silver, emeralds, and spices. Spanish galleons returned from Havana and Panama, loaded with continental riches. On each, hundreds of tons of treasure, on each, dozens of cannons. But where there's gold, there is shadow. Ships vanished without trace. Sometimes waves washed ashore broken fragments, mast remains, jugs, weapons. No people were found. Rumors spread through ports. It's not a storm. It's pirates. Thus appeared a new player on the scene, the sea wolf of the Age of Discovery. He was raised on the same navigation schools as the king's captains. He knew the stars, could read by compass, and acted cold-bloodedly. He was a criminal, but with a map, discipline, and seafaring cunning. In the 16th century, piracy became not just robbery, but a political instrument. European monarchies, fighting for colonies, began using pirates as weapons. Thus appeared privateers, private sea raiders with official licenses to plunder enemies. They brought profit to the treasury, and if caught, became criminals without signatures. The most famous of them, Francis Drake. He smashed Spanish ships, burned their ports, circumnavigated the globe, and returned with holds full of gold. Spain demanded his execution, but England met him with ovations. Queen Elizabeth personally knighted Drake right on the deck of a ship loaded with plunder. Thus, a pirate received the monarchy's blessing. But as soon as kings made peace, privateers became pirates again. They didn't know what rest meant. They couldn't live on land. The sea was their only home and their only law. In those years appeared the first pirate brotherhoods. Desperate people gathered in groups, went to the edges of empires, and lived by their own rules. They had no nationalities, no flags, only a common oath: divide everything equally and obey only your own. The first such republics arose in the Atlantic, off the coasts of Africa and the Caribbean, where one could hide in coves and disappear among reefs. Among them went a saying, "The wind is our judge, the sea is our home." The Spanish crown spent fortunes trying to clear the ocean, but piracy wasn't an accident. It was part of world trade. Trade routes bred raiders, and raiders fleets. The sea was a field where force and necessity collided. Every new galleon voyage was a gamble with fate. From Havana to Seville, 3 months' journey. On each leg, storm, scurvy, and danger. Pirates knew where and when caravans traveled, where their guard was weak, where the calm was. They attacked quickly, without warning, like predators, and then vanished. Historians love calling pirates parasites of empire. But that's an imprecise formulation. They were its shadow. Without colonies, there would be no pirates. Without pirates, there would be no fleet, insurance, navigation, patrol routes. The irony is that pirates accelerated the development of maritime civilization. They were enemies of order, but they did not despise its power. The crowds wildered. The band of this flow is light. In response to them arose insurance companies, courts, licenses, even the first international agreements on maritime law. By the 16th century, piracy became not just a threat, it became a cultural phenomenon. In London and La Rochelle taverns, they whispered names of people about whom no one could say if they were alive. They were called not by surnames, but by nicknames: Black Salma, John Cricket, Sea Dog. They disappeared beyond the horizon to return as legend. The world grew tighter, empires greedier, And amid this noise and gold appeared a generation that didn't want to belong to anyone. They believed neither in kings nor in fate. They believed only in the sea. And when we speak today of Caribbean pirates, of skulls on flags and songs over rum, it's important to remember it all began not with myth, but with a simple, almost ancient idea that a man has the right to take what's his if the world left him nothing. Chapter 2: The Caribbean Archipelago of Freedom and Chaos. Mid-17th century. The world grew larger, but no calmer. On the Atlantic map appeared new lands: the West Indies, Hispaniola, Tortuga, Jamaica, Barbados. Hundreds of islands separated by reefs, lagoons, and mirages. Paradise shores where cities, temples, and gallows were built. And in the midst of this tropical splendor lay a seething arena where empires, gold, and cannons met. The Spanish called the Caribbean Mar de los Ladrones, Sea of Thieves. And it was fair. After the discovery of America, Spain became Europe's richest state. Every year, convoys of dozens of galleons went from the New World to Seville. They carried silver from Potosi, gold from Panama, emeralds from Colombia, and sugar from Jamaica. These flotillas were called silver caravans. They were the crown's pride and the dream of all who ever held a saber. The Spanish armed ships created convoys and built fortresses, but still vessels disappeared. Sometimes they washed ashore with no trace of crew. Sometimes they simply weren't found at all. The sea was silent, but rumors grew. At the same time, French and English hunters settled on Tortuga and Hispaniola. They called themselves buccaneers, from the word boucan, a grill on which they smoked meat. First, they hunted cattle and pigs, then realized it was easier to hunt Spaniards. Buccaneers united, built ships, acquired weapons, and became the terror of the Caribbean. Historians call this moment the birth of pirate republics. Their center was Tortuga, a tiny island off Hispaniola's coast. Here operated laws unknown to any power. Anyone arriving could become a Brotherhood member if they swore an oath. They elected a captain, divided booty equally, and swore to obey no one but the sea. One of the most famous was Henry Morgan, son of a Welsh peasant who fled to the New World. He started as a mercenary, then became a captain, then Spain's nightmare. In 1668, he took the fortress at Portobello. 3 years later, Panama City. Both operations entered history as some of the boldest in maritime chronicles. Spain accused England of barbarism, but King Charles II gave Morgan a knighthood and appointed him Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica. A pirate became an official. It was so absurd that even his former comrades didn't know whether to laugh or hate him. By mid-17th century, piracy had ceased being just a crime. It became a system. Pirate havens turned into bustling cities, taverns, forges, warehouses, shipyards, markets, all operated without taxes, without licenses, without flags. An economy without a state. On Tortuga, for rum you could buy gunpowder, for pearls, a new mast. Coins barely existed. Booty was divided into shares. The captain got 2 shares, the navigator 1.5, each sailor 1. If someone lost an arm or leg, they received compensation from the common fund. These were the first forms of insurance, created not by bankers, but by people who knew the value of life. On land, monarchies prided themselves on hierarchy. At sea, people lived by equality. Captains were elected by vote. Anyone could object. If a captain was cowardly, he was removed. If the crew was lazy, the captain had the right to dismiss them. This was democracy forged in gunpowder and wind. Simple and harsh, but real. It was in the Caribbean that multicultural crews first appeared. On one ship could serve English, French, Irish, Dutch, Africans, and Indians. Many were escaped slaves whom pirates accepted as equals. In this ironic, lawless society, racial differences disappeared for the first time in history. On deck, what mattered wasn't skin color but ability to handle a sail. Pirates were the first to create an international community. Not by state agreement, but by the necessity of survival. Among them were women too. Bonny and Mary Read entered legend. They fought on equal terms with men, stood at the helm, and received their share of booty. When arrested, the judge asked, "Are women truly capable of this?" And Anne answered, "If you knew what women are capable of, you wouldn't be surprised we took your ship." Pirate flags also had meaning. Skull and Bones was a warning, surrender and we won't touch you. A red flag meant the opposite, no mercy. Each captain created his own symbol. Blackbeard showed a devil with a spear and hourglass. Calico Jacks had 2 crossed swords. These flags became piracy's first brand, a universal language of fear. Port Royal, capital of English Jamaica, became the center of this anarchic civilization. Here they feasted, traded, swore oaths, and betrayed one another. Contemporaries called it the most sinful city on earth. When an earthquake in 1692 flooded most of the city, witnesses said, "Hell took what was his." But no matter how kings tried to wipe pirates from the sea's face, they didn't disappear. Every hanged captain bred new ones. Every burned ship turned into a legend retold in taverns. The Caribbean became a symbol, a place where a man could be nobody and everybody at once, where a former slave became a captain and a deserter a judge, where gold, blood, and rum mixed into one, the taste of freedom. Historians call this period the Golden Age of Piracy. It didn't last long, less than 100 years. But during this time, people without homeland or law built a society where only one principle operated: divide fairly and die free. Chapter 3: Democracy Under the Black Flag. The deck smells of tar, sweat, and salt. Waves slap the hull, masts creak, sails flap in wind gusts. At dawn, the captain raises the flag, black cloth with skull and bones. You can't mistake it for anything else. This sign needs no translation. Today, the ship goes hunting. But before closing in on an enemy vessel, a decision must be made: attack or pass. And it's not the captain who decides. The crew decides. A 17th century pirate ship was, essentially, a floating republic. While on land subjects bowed to monarchs, here everyone had a voice. Captain elections were held openly. If a captain lost respect, he could be removed right during a raid. Sometimes without a fight, sometimes with one. The captain had power only in battle. Otherwise, decisions were made by council. On the ship existed positions like navigator, boatswain, and quartermaster. The last monitored booty division and the treasury. This was a sort of finance minister. elected by the crew. If someone tried to cheat or take extra, they could be left on a deserted island. This was called marooning, one of the most terrible pirate punishments. The main law was the code, Articles of Agreement. The entire crew signed it before a voyage. Each code differed, but the principles were similar. Booty divides fairly. For theft, death. For cowardice, exile. For injury, compensation. These documents survived. In Bartholomew Roberts' code, dated 1720, it states, "Everyone receives an equal share of booty. Captain and quartermaster get 1.5 shares each. If someone loses an arm or leg, 800 pieces of 8. If an eye or finger, 100 pieces of 8. This was history's first form of social insurance, based not on state mercy, but on collective agreement. Modern historians believe the Pirate Code was one of the first real examples of a social contract, about which Locke and Rousseau would later write. Only pirates didn't discuss philosophy, they simply lived by it. Everyone understood, without justice, the ship wouldn't survive. But democracy on pirate ships wasn't soft. It was held together by fear, discipline, and respect. If someone broke order, they were punished quickly. Thieves could be thrown overboard. Those drunk during watch were tied to the mast, and those who raised a hand against a comrade were marooned on an island with a bottle of water and a pistol with 1 bullet. But on the ship, there were no bosses in the usual sense. Even the captains slept in the same quarters, ate the same food, and received almost the same share as the others. Unlike merchant fleets where sailors were whipped, here only enemies were beaten. Pirate democracy was born not from ideals, but from necessity. At sea, a person completely depended on the crew. Without mutual trust, you wouldn't survive. If a sailor knew his voice had weight, he fought fiercer. If he knew he'd get a fair share, he wouldn't betray. This was simple but effective psychology, freedom as a survival method. On some ships, there even existed a rudimentary court. If someone violated the code, they held a meeting. Both sides were heard, witnesses spoke, and the crew voted. Thus were resolved issues from petty quarrels to murder. In other fleets, such things an officer decided with one order. Among pirates, it was a people's assembly. London archives preserve trial protocols where former pirates testified, "We elected Captain William, but he was drunk and unfair. We removed him and put the first mate in charge. He was brave, and while he led us, we won." These confessions show that on a pirate ship worked a principle that would appear in Europe only a century later: change of power through consent. But perhaps most amazing in these communities was the idea of equality. On land, a person was born peasant or nobleman and died the same. At sea, this didn't matter. In one crew could serve former slaves, soldiers, merchants, deserters, sailors, and women. Everyone who could hold a rope or saber had a right to a share. The pirate world was cruel but fair, as far as possible among people living by war. On ships often served black sailors, former slaves. Some became officers. There's a known case when an African named Diego was a navigator for Captain Morgan. On the ship, he was respected as a master of navigation. Admiralty archives record mixed crews, where half the team were Africans and Caribbean Indians. For the 17th century, this was unheard of equality. But the democratic structure didn't exclude superstitions. Pirates believed in fate, wind, and omens. It was believed that whistling on deck called up a storm. Women aboard were feared not from prejudice, but because their appearance supposedly brought doom. Ironic that precisely women, Anne Bonny and Mary Read, became symbols of pirate courage. Both dressed as men, fought in battles, and received equal shares. When arrested, Mary said at trial, "We don't ask forgiveness. We lived as we wanted." Pirate democracy was a short but bright flash. For 100 years, it proved that even among criminals, order is possible, built not on fear but on consent. And though their ships sank and flags burned, the idea itself that people can be equal without a king over their heads outlived them. When a ship raised the black flag, enemies saw a threat in it. But for those aboard, it was a symbol not of death, but of life, their own, earned by sweat, blood, and choice. Every raid could be the last, but none were in vain, because, perhaps for the first time in history, sailors exiled from society built their own, though bloody yet honest, republic. Somewhere in old ship logs are preserved lines. "Let them curse us on land, but at sea we are free men." And perhaps this is the main thing that distinguished pirates from all others. They knew freedom's price, and they paid for it every day. Chapter 4: World Without Borders, Languages, Colors, and Flags. 17th century pirate crews were a unique phenomenon. On one ship could serve English, French, Spanish, Irish, Africans, Indians, and even Arabs. These were the first truly international teams. On land, such people would never stand side by side. At sea, they had to rely on each other. Teams formed from all who could hold the helm and weren't afraid to fight. Former merchant ship sailors, escaped slaves, deserters, prisoners, all received equal shares in duties. Race, faith, and origin didn't matter. On the ship counted only competence and discipline. Pirate jargon was a mix of English, French, Spanish, and West African words. Scientists call this language the prototype of maritime pidgin English. It allowed people from different countries to communicate on levels of commands, navigation, and battle. This language later spread to merchant at the colonial fleets, becoming the base for many Atlantic coastal dialects. Pirate bases like Tortuga, Port Royal, and Nassau quickly turned into trade hubs. Here they sold weapons, rum, sugar, and fabrics. Slaves were exchanged for silver and gunpowder. The economy was based on the principle of mutual benefit. No taxes, no state officials. Captains made temporary alliances with each other, united for raids, and broke agreements after booty division. This was a form of self-regulating market, where reputation cost more than coins. Even European powers' military reports noted that pirates kept order. On ships operated clear statutes called Articles of Agreement. They defined shares, discipline, and responsibility. Thus, for the loss of a limb, they paid fixed sums. For theft from a comrade, immediate punishment. These rules worked precisely because they replaced state and law. The black flag with skull, Jolly Roger, became pirates' common symbol only by the early 18th century. Before this, each captain had his own sign. Edward Teach, known as Blackbeard, flew a skeleton with a spear and hourglass. Calico Jack had 2 crossed swords. A red flag meant battle without mercy. Black meant an offer to surrender. The flag performed not a decorative but a practical function. It saved time. Seeing it, A merchant ship understood it was better to lower sails than be destroyed. Pirate cities resembled military camps. Women were a minority, but played a notable role. Anne Bonny and Mary Read served on ships, participated in battles, and received equal shares. On land, their names entered British court reports, confirming that equality on pirate ships was not myth, but documented fact. Pirates' moral code was direct. Don't attack those with whom an agreement has been made. Divide fairly. Don't kill without necessity. These principles distinguished them from robbers operating on land. Even European officers admitted that inside pirate communities, discipline was higher than on royal ships. By historian Marcus Rediker's estimates, in the early 18th century, up to half of pirate crews consisted of former slaves or indentured servants. On some ships, the African proportion exceeded 60%. This made pirates not just criminals, but a social phenomenon, a society where for the first time in the New World operated equality of people of different races. For European powers, piracy was a threat, but in a broader sense, it became an experiment. People exiled from empires built their own order, crude but working, without officials, without judges, without coats of arms. The system was held together by personal reputation, collective responsibility, and fear of shame. Pirates didn't create a utopia. They sought survival in a world where they were left no place. But the result turned out more important than the intentions. They were the first to prove that an international society was possible without borders, without nations, and without central power. That's why in 18th century archives, reports on fighting pirates read not only as military dispatches, but as testimony of a collision of two systems, imperial and autonomous. The first was built on submission, the second on agreement. Pirates lost in force, but won in the idea. Their ships sank, but the principle of equality born on their decks remained in history. Chapter 5: The Myth of Freedom and Its Price. Pirate freedom looked like a dream. In reality, it was hard work and constant risk. Every day could end with a storm, powder magazine explosion, or saber blow in the back. On land, a pirate was considered a hero. At sea, a person who barely lived to the next dawn. The average captain's life in piracy's golden age was about 2 to 3 years. Regular sailors lasted a bit longer. The reasons were the same: disease, execution, storms, betrayal. Mortality exceeded military fleet rates. The freedom that novelists later wrote about was in practice a regime of continuous stress. The pirate economy was fundamentally unstable. Unlike legitimate merchants who built wealth over time, pirates operated on a boom or bust cycle. A successful raid could make a crew wealthy overnight, but that wealth evaporated just as quickly. Court records from Port Royal reveal the pattern. A pirate ship captures a Spanish merchant vessel carrying 40,000 pieces of eight. Divided among 80 men, each sailor receives 500 pieces, equivalent to 5 years' wages for a merchant seaman. Within 2 weeks, most of the crew is broke. The money flows into taverns, brothels, gambling dens, and provisioners who charge triple the normal rates. This wasn't simple irresponsibility. Pirates spent everything because saving was irrational. They couldn't deposit money in banks. They were wanted men. They couldn't invest in property. They owned no land. They couldn't plan for retirement. Most wouldn't live to see 30. The psychological impact was profound. When every day might be your last, deferred gratification becomes meaningless. Ship surgeons' logs paint a grim picture of pirate health. Scurvy was endemic. Infections from untreated wounds killed more men than combat. Dysentery, malaria, yellow fever all ravaged crews in the tropics. One surgeon aboard Bartholomew Roberts' ship recorded that of 90 men who began a 6-month voyage, 23 died of disease, 15 were killed in action, and only 40 were fit for duty by voyage's end. On the ship, everything depended on discipline. The code was harsh because otherwise the crew would fall apart. For drunkenness during watch, flogging, or being put ashore without supplies. For theft, death. Pirate democracy existed only while order was maintained. Freedom and the captain's authority balanced on a knife's edge. One failed raid was enough, and the crew would change him, sometimes with a knife in hand. But here lay a crucial paradox. Pirate discipline was often stricter than on naval vessels, yet entirely voluntary. A sailor couldn't be pressed into pirate service. He signed the articles of his own will. Once signed, those articles bound him absolutely. Break them, and the crew became judge and executioner. This created a strange hybrid, libertarian principles enforced through draconian means. You were free to elect your captain, but once elected, his orders in battle were absolute. You had a voice in council, but speak against the majority decision, and you might find yourself marooned. The freedom pirates celebrated was collective, not individual. You were free from kings and merchants, but bound tightly to your crew. Some crews maintained discipline through ritual humiliation. The cold bath involved tying an offender to the bowsprit and dragging him through the water at full sail. Sweating meant making a man run in circles around the mast while the crew jabbed at him with knives. These punishments were voted on by the crew, democracy in action, however brutal. Relations between pirates and states were always pragmatic. While war raged, kings used pirates as cheap private fleets. When peace came, the same people were hanged. Many privateers didn't have time to understand at what moment their license stopped working. Thus, on the scaffold hung people who just yesterday had acted by the crown's order. The transition from privateer to pirate was often gradual and ambiguous. A man might cross the legal line while still believing himself a legitimate operator, and if his home colony welcomed his money, they'd confirm that belief. Consider Thomas Tew, who received a commission from the governor of Bermuda to attack French settlements. Instead, he sailed to the Indian Ocean, took a Mughal treasure ship, and returned to Rhode Island, where he was welcomed as a hero and investor in the colony. He made 3 more voyages, each less legal than the last, until finally killed by a cannonball to the stomach. Or Henry Avery, who led a mutiny aboard the privateer Charles II, renamed it Fancy, and captured the Mughal emperor's ship Ganges Sawai, carrying 600,000 pounds in gold and silver, equivalent to roughly 100 pounds million today. The resulting diplomatic crisis nearly cost England its trading rights in India. Avery became the most wanted man in the world, yet he vanished completely, possibly living out his days in quiet retirement under a false name. These cases illustrate a truth empires preferred to ignore. They created the pirate problem by weaponizing private sailors during wartime, then criminalizing them during peace. The boundary between legal and illegal was determined not by actions, but by political convenience. The pirate republic in Nassau lasted less than 10 years, but it represented piracy's purest expression. From 1706 to 1718, New Providence Island operated without government, law, or formal economy, yet functioned as a thriving port. Ships came and went, goods were traded, disputes were settled, all without courts, police, or taxes. How? Through a system of reputation and reciprocity. A captain who cheated in a deal would find no crew willing to sail with him. A merchant who sold spoiled provisions would find no customers. The threat of social ostracism maintained order more effectively than any law. But this system had fatal flaws. It couldn't resolve large-scale conflicts. When Benjamin Hornigold and Henry Jennings quarreled over hunting grounds, their followers nearly went to war. Without government to adjudicate, such disputes escalated quickly. More critically, Nassau couldn't defend itself. It had no permanent fortifications, no standing army, no treasury for defense. When England sent Woodes Rogers as governor in 1718 with 3 warships and a king's pardon, the pirate republic collapsed without a fight. Some pirates accepted the pardon, others fled to remote hideouts. A few, like Charles Vane, fought on, but isolated and hunted. After England declared amnesty and promised salaries to those who would transfer to fleet service, half the pirates surrendered. The rest were hanged. This showed that their freedom was held together by fear and fatigue, not ideology. Most men hadn't chosen piracy for liberty. They'd chosen it because they saw no other way to survive. When offered legitimate work with reasonable pay, many took it. The myth of the pirate as a free man appeared later in 19th century novels. Real seafarers were pragmatists. They sought not adventures, but a chance to earn and escape poverty. Almost all had in their youth served on merchant or military ships, where they were beaten, deceived, and deprived of wages. Piracy gave them the only way to get an equal share. This was economic rebellion, not romance. Maritime employment in the 18th century was brutal. Merchant sailors earned £1 to £2 per month, paid only if the voyage succeeded. Captains routinely cheated crew out of wages, citing imaginary damages or debts for supplies. Physical punishment was arbitrary and severe. Naval impressment gangs kidnapped men off the street and forced them into service for years. Against this backdrop, piracy offered something radical: fair pay, democratic voice, and compensation for injury. A sailor who lost a leg in merchant service got nothing. A pirate received 800 pieces of eight, enough to live on for years. Trial transcripts reveal the calculus. When asked why he turned pirate, John Archer testified, "I served 4 years on a merchantman and made £5 total. In 6 months as a pirate, I made £400. Another, William Williams, said simply, "They paid us fairly and didn't beat us. That was reason enough." This wasn't revolutionary ideology. It was basic labor economics. Pirates accidentally created one of history's first workers' cooperatives, where labor owned the means of production and distributed profits equitably. They did this not from political theory, but from practical necessity. Freedom ended where hunger or a waterspout began. A ship without authority died as quickly as a state without law. Therefore, captains kept order more strictly than kings. Captive testimonies show that pirates could be cruel, but almost always kept promises. If a victim surrendered, they were mostly released. If they resisted, they were destroyed. This was contract law working better than the metropolis's decrees. But this contract law masked a darker truth. Pirates lived in perpetual psychological crisis. They existed in liminal space. Neither fully outside society, they needed ports to sell goods, nor within it, they were hunted criminals. This created what modern psychology would call chronic stress disorder. Ship journals record the symptoms: explosive violence over minor disputes, paranoid suspicion of betrayal, wild mood swings between euphoria after a capture and deep despair during dry spells. Alcohol abuse was near universal, not for recreation but self-medication. Some crews consumed several gallons of rum per man per week. The social mechanism of pirate liberty was simple: high responsibility at zero security. Equality and the ability to elect a captain created a sense of justice, but psychologically everything was held together by fear. No one could leave the ship without permission. An attempted desertion almost always ended in death. Pirate freedom was built on restrictions the crew accepted voluntarily because the alternative was worse. In battles, these restrictions turned into strength. Pirates fought harder than military sailors. They had no second chance. If the ship lost, all were hanged. Therefore, they acted aggressively and cold-bloodedly. An attack lasted minutes. Everything was decided by accurate volleys and boarding speed. State's fear of pirates was not in their numbers, but in their efficiency. This explains pirate tactics: overwhelming violence designed to force immediate surrender. They would approach under false colors, raise the black flag at the last moment, fire a warning shot. Most merchant crews surrendered without fighting. They weren't paid enough to die for cargo. The pirates' reputation for brutality when resisted ensured that resistance was rare. Most captains died not in battle, but on the gallows. London, Port Royal, Boston, everywhere. They set up gallows by the shores so sailors could see their predecessors' bodies. This was both a warning and an advertisement. Each noose made pirates into legend. Witnesses wrote that the public paid for places at the scaffold. Newspapers published the condemned's last words. Thus arose the romantic image that lives on to this day. The execution ritual was carefully orchestrated theater. Condemned pirates were paraded through streets in carts, sometimes for hours, to maximize public viewing. At the gallows, they were allowed, even encouraged, to give final speeches. Many used this platform for defiance. Captain John Quelch, in 1704, they should also take care how they bring money into New England, to be hanged for it. William Fly, in 1726, lectured the crowd on the evils of merchant captains who abused their crews, then criticized the hangman's technique in tying the noose. These speeches were transcribed, printed, and sold as broadsides, the tabloid media of their day. Each execution generated hundreds of pamphlets. The authorities wanted deterrence, but got martyrdom. They turned pirates into folk heroes, precisely by trying to make examples of them. Behind this image lies simple arithmetic. Of every 100 pirates, 5 lived to old age. The rest die in battles, storms, or on the block. Even successful captains like Bartholomew Roberts or Blackbeard ended their lives in battle. After them, piracy became rarer, but the myth grew stronger. Pirate freedom truly existed, but it didn't liberate, it demanded. It gave the right to decide, but forced payment for each decision. A pirate lived by his will but died by power's law. Historians believe this is the main paradox of their world. Freedom turned out not to be a reward, but a trial. Consider what pirates gave up: the possibility of family. Few could safely maintain wives and children, the comfort of home, always on the move, sleeping in hammocks, the security of accumulated wealth, spending everything immediately, and the hope of old age, knowing death was near. What did they gain? The right to elect their leaders, the assurance of fair pay, the absence of arbitrary punishment, and the dignity of equal treatment. These were genuine freedoms, but they came at an existential cost. That's why pirate republics didn't survive. They could exist only while battle raged. Peacetime destroyed them faster than cannons. Without an enemy and danger, the pirate model lost meaning. They knew how to live in chaos, but not in order. Nassau, under Woodes Rogers, became a functioning colonial town precisely because it stopped being a pirate haven. Former pirates who accepted the pardon became merchants, craftsmen, fishermen, conventional citizens. Those who rejected peace couldn't sustain themselves. They became scattered raiders, then hunted fugitives, then corpses on gibbets, or bones on the ocean floor. The myth of freedom remained because it's convenient. It explains why people deprived of everything went to certain death. It gives the illusion that one can break from the system by willpower alone. But in reality, pirates didn't break the system. They showed its limits. Where total freedom begins, there also begins self-destruction. True freedom requires more than absence of constraint. It requires security, resources, and time. Precisely what pirates lacked. They achieved liberty from external authority only by accepting total dependence on their crew and perpetual insecurity. They escaped wage slavery only by embracing a more absolute form of bondage to the ship, the sea, and the short, violent arc of their careers. Thus ended the time of people living between wind and law. They burned their flags and went into legends, leaving one last lesson. Any freedom has a price, and the purer it seems, the more expensive it costs. The last great pirate captain, Bartholomew Roberts, understood this. His personal motto was, "A merry life and a short one." He lived by it and died by it, killed at age 39 by grape shot to the throat, while wearing his finest crimson damask waistcoat and diamonds. His crew, per his standing orders, weighted his body with cannonballs and cast it into the sea, so authorities couldn't display his corpse. In death as in life, Roberts chose his own terms. That was the essence of pirate freedom, not the ability to live as you wished, but the determination to die as you chose. It was a freedom defined by negation, not freedom to, but freedom from. And for men with nothing left to lose, that was enough. Chapter 6: Famous Personalities and Women Pirates. Piracy's history isn't abstract mythology, but concrete people. Their names were whispered in ports from Cuba to Cornwall. Their descriptions circulated in British Admiralty reports and French naval chronicles. Most lived short, violent lives, yet managed to rewrite the rules of maritime warfare and embed themselves permanently in human imagination. Edward Teach, nicknamed Blackbeard, didn't just become the embodiment of fear, he engineered it with theatrical precision. Before battle, he would weave slow-burning fuses into his thick black beard and light them, so smoke wreathed his face like something conjured from hell itself. Witnesses described the effect as terrifying, a figure emerging from gun smoke, with his own face on fire, eyes gleaming through the sulphurous haze. But this wasn't mere showmanship. It was calculated psychological warfare that often won battles before a single shot was fired. By contemporaries' testimonies, Teach was methodical and surprisingly calculating. He studied his targets, knew their routes, understood their psychology. He preferred to intimidate an enemy into surrender rather than waste ammunition and risk casualties. Terror was more economical than combat. On his flagship, Queen Anne's Revenge, a captured French slave ship he'd converted into a 40-gun monster, served up to 300 men. The ship itself became part of his legend. His end came in November 1718, off Ocracoke Island, North Carolina. Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Royal Navy tracked him there. The battle was brief and savage. Teach fought like a cornered animal. Historical accounts record he suffered 5 bullet wounds and more than 20 sword cuts before he finally fell. Even then, legend says he tried to reach for his pistol. His head was severed and hung from Maynard's bowsprit as they sailed back to Virginia, proof that the devil himself could bleed. If Teach was theater, then Bartholomew Roberts was discipline made flesh. Black Bart stood as piracy's strangest contradiction, a teetotaler commanding men who lived for rum, a man of fastidious habits leading a profession built on chaos. Roberts came to piracy almost by accident. Captured by pirates in 1719, while serving as a merchant ship's officer, he became a rare exception to the pirate code. A skilled navigator pressed into their crew against his will. When their captain died 6 weeks later, the crew elected Roberts to replace him. He was 37, ancient by pirate standards, and hesitated before accepting. "If I must be a pirate," he reportedly said, "I'll be a successful one." He kept that promise with terrifying efficiency. In just 3 years between 1719 and 1722, Roberts captured over 400 vessels, an absolute record that will never be broken, because there will never again be a world where such piracy is possible. His success came from treating piracy as a profession, not a drunken adventure. His personal code, famously strict, forbade gambling and drunkenness among his crew. It included provisions that seem almost modern: lights out by 8 p.m., no boy or woman allowed aboard to prevent jealousy and disorder, musicians given some days off as a day of rest. Any man who lost a limb received compensation from a common fund: 800 pieces of 8 for a right arm, 600 for the left, 100 for an eye. This was insurance before insurance companies, disability compensation before governments provided it. Yet Roberts could be ruthlessly cruel when his rules were broken, or when enemies showed him disrespect. When the governor of Martinique sent ships to hunt him, Roberts returned and captured the governor himself, then hanged him from his yardarm. His personal flag became infamous. It showed him standing with a sword atop 2 skulls, labeled ABH and AMH, a Barbadian's head and a Martinican's head, representing the governors of those islands who had pursued him. He died in February 1722, off the coast of Gabon, in battle with HMS Swallow, or His Majesty's ship Swallow. Grape shot tore through his throat as he stood on deck in his finest crimson damask waistcoat, diamond cross at his neck, 2 pistols on silk ribbons across his chest. His crew, following his standing orders, wrapped him in sail and cast him into the sea immediately, so the Royal Navy couldn't display his body as a trophy. His personal motto had been a merry life and a short one. He got both. After his death began the true decline of piracy's golden age. Henry Morgan's story reveals something uncomfortable. The difference between pirate and hero often comes down to which flag you're flying. Born in Wales to a farming family, Morgan arrived in the Caribbean as a young man and started as a privateer, operating under English license to attack Spanish holdings. But the line between authorized raiding and piracy was always blurred, and Morgan crossed it repeatedly. His 1668 assault on Portobello, Panama, became legendary for its audacity. With just 450 men, he captured a fortified city defended by 3 castles and 300 soldiers. His tactics were brutal. He used captured Spanish civilians as human shields, forcing them to carry ladders and scale the walls ahead of his man. It worked. 3 years later came his masterpiece, the sack of Panama City itself, the richest settlement in the Spanish Main. Morgan led 1,500 men on a grueling march through jungle, fought a pitched battle outside the city's walls, then watched as most of Panama burned. The expedition made Morgan wealthy, but also controversial. Spain screamed for his head. England, embarrassed by his timing, peace negotiations were underway, arrested him and shipped him to London for trial. But instead of the gallows, Morgan found royal favor. King Charles II knighted him and appointed him Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica. The pirate became the law. Morgan spent his remaining years prosecuting his former comrades, sending men to the gallows who'd once sailed under his command. When he died in 1688, he received a state funeral with a 22-gun salute. His transformation showed piracy's essential political nature. Morgan's actions didn't change, just his authorization. William Kidd's story is tragic precisely because he may have been the only famous pirate who genuinely believed he was innocent. A prosperous Scottish sea captain based in New York, Kidd received what seemed like an opportunity, a privateering commission from English aristocrats, including the king himself, to hunt pirates in the Indian Ocean. But everything went wrong. The voyage took too long, his crew grew mutinous, they found no pirates, and expenses mounted. Desperate, Kidd crossed the line. He captured the Q-Dog Merchant, an Armenian ship carrying valuable cargo. Kidd convinced himself it was legal. The ship had French papers in a time of war with France. The ship also had a Mughal Empire-issued pass. Kidd had just robbed the Grand Mughal's subjects. When Kidd sailed back to the Caribbean, he discovered he'd been declared a pirate. His aristocratic backers, fearing scandal, had abandoned him. Before surrendering, Kidd did something almost no other pirate had done. He buried his treasure on Gardiner's Island, off New York. Not his retirement savings, but his insurance, leverage for negotiations. He told Governor Bellamont where it was, hoping to trade the treasure's location for clemency. It failed spectacularly. Bellamont arrested Kidd, seized the treasure, and shipped him to London. The trial was a show trial from the start. In 1701, Kidd was hanged at Execution Dock. The rope broke on the first attempt, and Kidd, battered from the fall, had to be hanged again. His body was then suspended in an iron cage over the Thames for 3 years as a warning. Kidd's buried treasure, the only verified case of a pirate actually doing this, became the seed from which the entire treasure map myth would grow. John Rackham, nicknamed Calico Jack for his flashy clothing, became famous not so much for battles as for his flag, skull with 2 crossed sabers, and for what sailed aboard his ship. On Rackham's vessels served 2 women who would shatter every assumption about gender and piracy, Anne Bonny and Mary Read. They became the only women pirates whose stories were confirmed by court protocols and trial records. Anne Bonny's early life reads like scandal. Born illegitimate in Ireland, daughter of a lawyer and his housemaid, she immigrated with her father to Carolina. By all accounts, she was beautiful, fiery-tempered, and utterly unwilling to accept the constrained life offered to women. She married a small-time sailor, but when her father disowned her for the marriage, the couple drifted to Nassau, the pirate republic. There, she met Calico Jack Rackham. Anne left her husband for Rackham and joined his crew, dressing as a man and participating fully in raids. Mary Read's path was stranger still. Born in England, she'd been raised as a boy by her mother in a scheme to defraud Mary's grandmother of money meant for her deceased older brother. Mary kept the disguise, finding that male clothing opened doors. She served in the British military, fought in Flanders, then served on merchant ships before being captured by pirates. She joined them willingly. When Mary Read joined Calico Jack's crew, neither she nor Anne Bonny initially knew the other was a woman. The discovery of each other's secret created a bond. Trial records and contemporary accounts confirm both women fought in battles, wore men's clothing, carried pistols and cutlasses, and received equal shares of plunder. One often repeated story tells of Mary Read falling in love with a young carpenter. When another pirate challenged the carpenter to a duel that would surely kill him, Mary Read challenged that pirate herself. 2 hours earlier, she killed him, saving her lover's life. Their career ended in October 1720 when a Jamaican privateer Hunter surprised Rackham's ship at anchor. Most of the male crew, including Rackham, were drunk below decks. Only Anne Bonny, Mary Read, and 1 male crew member fought back, firing pistols and cursing the men to come up and fight. The resistance failed. At trial, Anne and Mary both pleaded their bellies, declared themselves pregnant, which automatically postponed execution. Mary died of fever in prison before giving birth. Anne Bonny simply vanished from records. Some say her wealthy father ransomed her. Others claim she died in prison. Still others insist she lived under a new identity to old age. What's certain is what Anne said to Calico Jack when he was brought to the gallows. He requested to see her one last time. Her words, recorded by multiple witnesses, have echoed through centuries. "I'm sorry to see you here, Jack, but if you'd fought like a man, you needn't hang like a dog." Though she predated the Caribbean's Golden Age by nearly a century, Ireland's Grace O'Malley deserves mention as perhaps history's most successful female pirate leader. Born around 1530 to a seafaring clan in Western Ireland, Grace commanded multiple ships, controlled territory, negotiated with queens, and maintained her power for over 40 years. She met Queen Elizabeth I in 1593, allegedly refusing to bow because she regarded herself as Elizabeth's equal. Unlike Caribbean pirates, Grace operated more as a coastal warlord, charging protection money, raiding rivals, and fighting English colonization. She married twice, always retaining control of her own forces. She lived into her 70s, remarkable for any 16th century person, extraordinary for a pirate. Her legacy endured in Irish folklore as the Pirate Queen. Proof that centuries before Anne Bonny and Mary Read, at least one woman had commanded pirates, not by disguise, but by pure force of will. These people were neither heroes nor monsters. They were human beings caught in the machinery of empire, war, and economy. Their lives were defined by circumstances, poverty, conflict, and the lawlessness of contested waters. None built lasting institutions or wrote political treatises, yet each, in their own way, shaped a myth that outlived them by centuries. Blackbeard became fear's archetype, the darkness sailors whispered about. Roberts showed that even criminals could value order and fairness, while maintaining discipline stricter than any navy. Morgan proved how easily the state could transform pirates into officials when politically convenient. Kidd demonstrated how innocence meant nothing when politics demanded a scapegoat. And Anne Bonny and Mary Read did something perhaps more revolutionary. They proved that the assumptions societies made about women were assumptions, not truths. By the 1720s, piracy as a mass phenomenon was ending, but the personalities who embodied it did more than rob ships. They turned the black flag into a symbol of defiance that would resonate through centuries of art, literature, and popular imagination. Chapter 7, Treasure Island, Truth and Fiction. A cross on a yellowed map, its edges burned and mysterious. A chest bound with iron, filled to the brim with gold doubloons and Spanish pieces of 8. A lonely island, somewhere in the Caribbean, ringed by reefs, marked by a skull-shaped rock. 15 men on the dead man's chest, yo-ho-ho, and a bottle of rum. These images are seared into our collective consciousness. They form the core of the pirate myth, its most powerful and enduring component. And almost every element is pure fiction, brilliant literary mystification, born more than a century after the last cannons fell silent in the Caribbean. The documented history of piracy is not a history of treasure buried and saved. It's a history of treasure stolen and immediately spent. The truth was harsh and prosaic. Pirates didn't save money because they couldn't afford to think about tomorrow. A captured pirate interrogated in Boston in 1724 gave testimony that encapsulates the entire Golden Age economic philosophy. Our freedom is having everything today, for tomorrow we'll feed the fishes. Why didn't pirates bury treasures? The answer lies in 3 interconnected realities: their codes, their cargo, and their psychology. First, the pirate code demanded immediate division. Those articles of agreement weren't suggestions, they were law, enforced by men who'd kill you for breaking them. As soon as a vessel was captured and fighting ceased, the crew gathered on deck for the share-out. The quartermaster divided everything into portions according to rank. An attempt to hide even a single coin was considered the gravest crime possible. Theft from your brothers, betrayal of the sacred compact that held the crew together. Punishment was almost always death, either by bullet or by marooning on a deserted island with nothing but a bottle of water and a pistol with 1 round. To bury a chest of common booty would mean deceiving your entire crew. No captain would risk his authority and his life for a theoretical retirement fund he'd probably never live to use. Second, most booty wasn't gold. Our imagination conjures chests of coins, but this was rare. More commonly, pirates captured cargo, barrels of sugar and rum, bales of silk and indigo, sacks of cocoa and flour, kegs of gunpowder, crates of muskets, chests of medicine, and human beings. Enslaved people represented a significant portion of captured cargo, a grim reality we must acknowledge. All these assets were perishable or required maintenance. Fabrics rotted in tropical humidity. Rum evaporated. Flour was devoured by rats. These weren't assets you could bury and forget. They needed immediate conversion to currency. The only places that conversion could happen were the pirate ports: Tortuga, early Nassau, Port Royal before the earthquake. Immediately after a raid, ships sailed there, where shadow merchants waited to buy stolen goods at a fraction of their value. The pirates knew they were being cheated, but they had no choice. Only these merchants would trade with wanted men. The money received was spent with shocking speed. Within days, sometimes hours, fortunes vanished into taverns, gambling dens, and brothels. 1 week after a successful raid that might net each sailor the equivalent of 5 years' legitimate wages, the crew would be broke and ready for the next desperate venture. Third came the psychological impossibility of saving. The average pirate career lasted 2 to 3 years before death by battle, disease, storm, or execution. They lived under constant existential threat. Planning 5 years ahead wasn't just impractical, it was absurd, almost psychologically impossible. Every day might be your last. Better to spend everything now, enjoy what you can while breath remains in your lungs, than die with money you never used. Yet, like all powerful myths, the treasure legend has a seed of historical truth. One seed from which grew literature's mighty oak. That seed was William Kidd. As we discussed, before surrendering to authorities, he buried part of his treasure on Gardiner's Island. It was a desperate insurance policy, leverage in what he hoped would be negotiations for clemency. The plan failed catastrophically. Governor Bellamont arrested him immediately and seized the buried treasure as evidence. A detailed inventory was compiled by colonial officials. Found 754 ounces of gold, 1,112 ounces of silver, bags with sugar, silks, and ingots valued at approximately 10,000 pounds. Kidd was shipped to London, tried, convicted, and hanged. But the damage, or rather the gift to future storytellers, was done. A pirate had verifiably buried treasure. The fact entered official records. Newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic reported it as sensation. Just one case, one desperate gambit by an atypical pirate. Yet that single documented instance created a myth that would outlive every actual pirate by centuries. The myth was fertilized by other stories, some true, some embellished, most impossible to verify. The most tantalizing legend belongs to the French pirate Olivier Levasseur. He operated in the Indian Ocean in the 1720s, preying on ships traveling between India and Europe. His greatest success came in 1721, when he captured a Portuguese ship reportedly carrying treasure worth millions. Levasseur was finally captured by French authorities and hanged on Réunion Island in 1730. According to legend, and it remains only legend, as he stood on the scaffold with the noose around his neck, Levasseur threw a piece of parchment into the crowd and shouted, "Find my treasure, who can?" This parchment supposedly contained a cryptogram, a coded message revealing his treasure's location. Whether it actually existed is unknown. No contemporary official records mention it. Yet the story persisted, and in the 19th and 20th centuries, treasure hunters spent fortunes searching the Seychelles Islands. Some claimed to have found the cryptogram or copies of it. None led to treasure. Most were likely forgeries. But the story was too perfect to die, a pirate's final act of defiance, a puzzle thrown to the ages. Edward Teach, master of psychological warfare, also contributed to the treasure myth through calculated mystique. He loved creating an aura of supernatural menace around himself. When crew members asked about his share of the booty, Teach allegedly replied, "Only the devil and I know where my treasure lies, and whichever of us two lives longer shall take it all." This wasn't a treasure map, it was theater, another element of the terrifying persona Teach cultivated. But statements like this, repeated in taverns, embellished by sailors, passed into lore. When Teach died, treasure hunters began searching the inlets and islands where he'd operated. They found nothing, because there was nothing to find. Over a century passed. The pirates died, were hanged, or disappeared into anonymous retirement. The oceans became safer, regulated by increasingly powerful navies. Piracy faded from menace to memory. And then, literature took its revenge. The Victorian era, hungry for adventure and exotic locales, discovered the pirate past. Writers recognized the narrative potential in those old stories. Washington Irving wrote The Devil and Tom Walker in 1824, featuring Captain Kidd's buried treasure, guarded by the devil himself. Edgar Allan Poe elevated the treasure hunt to intellectual exercise in The Gold Bug in 1843, where the protagonist decodes a cryptogram to find Captain Kidd's hidden wealth. But the writer who truly created the modern pirate myth was Robert Louis Stevenson. Treasure Island, published in 1883, didn't just retell pirate legends, it invented the language of pirate mythology. Almost everything we think we know about pirates comes not from history, but from Stevenson's imagination. The treasure map, with the X marking the spot, Stevenson invented it. The black spot, a death sentence delivered on tar-marked paper, pure invention. The one-legged pirate with a parrot on his shoulder, that's Long John Silver, Stevenson's creation. Pirate speech filled with pieces of eight, doubloons, and shiver-me timbers. Stevenson created or popularized most of these phrases. The book became a global phenomenon. It's never been out of print since 1883. It defined pirate fiction for generations. Every pirate movie, every children's book, every Halloween costume traces lineage back to Stevenson's masterpiece. But Stevenson did something more profound than create entertaining fiction. He transformed pirates in collective memory. The real pirates, desperate, often cruel men fleeing poverty and oppression, became romantic adventurers on quests for treasure. The brutal economics of piracy became a puzzle-solving adventure with coded maps and buried chests. This literary alchemy changed history itself, or at least our memory of it. If you want to find actual pirate treasure, don't search islands, search the ocean floor. When pirate ships sank, their contents sank with them. And unlike deliberately buried treasure, which barely existed, shipwrecks are real, locable, and occasionally discovered. The Whydah Galley provides the perfect example. In 1717, the pirate Samuel Black-Sam Bellamy captured this slave ship and converted it to his flagship. Bellamy was sailing up the American coast with his fleet when a massive storm struck off Cape Cod. The Whydah broke apart on the shoals. Bellamy and all but 2 of his 146-man crew drowned. The ship lay undiscovered for 267 years. Then, in 1984, underwater explorer Barry Clifford found it. What emerged from the ocean floor was astonishing. Over 200,000 artifacts, including thousands of gold and silver coins, gold bars, jewelry, weapons, cannons, the ship's bell inscribed, the Whydah Galley, and even human remains. This was real pirate treasure, not buried intentionally, but claimed by the sea. Similar discoveries followed. In 1996, archaeologists found the wreck of Blackbeard's flagship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, off North Carolina's coast. Excavations continue, revealing thousands of artifacts that teach us more about actual pirate life than any treasure map ever could. So, pirate treasure chests buried on islands are fiction. Why does the myth remain so powerful? Because it offers something irresistible: the possibility of sudden transformation, the idea that somewhere in the world exists a shortcut to wealth, requiring only courage, cleverness, and luck to find. This fantasy appeals to something deep in human psychology, the hope that life's inequalities might be overcome by a lucky break rather than years of grinding labor. The pirate treasure myth is essentially a lottery fantasy dressed in historical costume. The ironic truth is that pirates did have a treasure, but it wasn't gold buried on islands. Their real treasure was their freedom. Temporary, precarious, blood-soaked freedom, but freedom nonetheless. And the only map that mattered to them wasn't a coded parchment, but a navigational chart showing trade routes, currents, safe harbors, and reefs where they could hide from pursuing warships. Chapter 8. What Pirates Left Behind. Piracy didn't vanish. It transformed into something perhaps more powerful than the thing itself: collective memory, cultural mythology, and surprising practical legacies. It ceased being a crime and became a permanent fixture in human imagination. But behind the romantic image of adventurers seeking treasure lies genuine historical inheritance that shaped the modern world in ways we rarely recognize. Pirates, paradoxically, helped create the legal framework that would eventually destroy them. Their very existence forced 17th and 18th century powers to develop international agreements on jurisdiction in open waters. Who could prosecute crimes committed outside any nation's territorial seas? The concept of hostis humani generis, enemy of all mankind, was first systematically applied to pirates. This legal designation meant pirates weren't criminals against one nation, but against human civilization itself. Any nation could capture, try, and execute them, regardless of their nationality or where their crimes occurred. This revolutionary legal principle laid foundations for modern international law. Today's concepts for prosecuting terrorists, war criminals, and organized crime leaders trace their intellectual lineage back to 18th century piracy law. The idea that certain crimes are so grave they authorize universal jurisdiction began with pirates and privateers. The British Admiralty courts, which tried most captured pirates, developed many procedures still used in maritime and international law: rules of evidence for crimes on the high seas, standards for witness testimony across national boundaries, protocols for dividing captured property. Piracy also forced competing empires to cooperate, creating some of history's first international law enforcement agreements. Spain, England, France, and the Netherlands, powers that spent most of the 17th and 18th centuries at war with each other, nonetheless occasionally shared intelligence about pirate movements and coordinated naval patrols. These weren't formal treaties like we'd recognize today, but they were precedents. Powers learned that certain threats transcended national rivalry. This realization would eventually lead to international organizations, but the concept began with pirate hunting. The modern insurance industry owes an enormous debt to pirates. Marine insurance existed before the Golden Age of Piracy, but pirates forced it to become systematic, mathematical, and reliable. Lloyd's of London, perhaps the world's most famous insurance institution, began in Edward Lloyd's coffee house in 1686, right at the beginning of piracy's golden age. Shipowners, merchants, and underwriters gathered there to share information about safe routes, pirate sightings, and losses. Pirates forced the insurance industry to develop actuarial science, the mathematical calculation of risk, and appropriate premium pricing. If your ship sailed to the Caribbean in 1710, you paid higher premiums than for a North Atlantic voyage, because pirates controlled Caribbean waters. This pricing reflected quantified risk, a concept now fundamental to all insurance, finance, and indeed, modern capitalism itself. Pirates also drove the development of sophisticated cargo documentation. Bills of lading, cargo manifests, proof of legitimate ownership became essential for proving a cargo wasn't stolen. This paper trail made it harder for pirates to sell captured goods and easier for authorities to identify stolen merchandise. These documentation systems evolved into modern supply chain management and customs procedures. Pirates forced European powers to maintain permanent naval forces rather than simply assembling fleets during wartime. The Royal Navy, the French Marine Royale, the Spanish Armada de Barlovento, all maintained standing patrols protecting trade routes, a major expense but necessary investment. This created modern naval strategy, not just fighting battles between fleets, but controlling sea lanes, protecting commerce, showing the flag, projecting power. These concepts, now fundamental to naval thinking, emerged largely from the need to suppress piracy. Pirates left an archaeological legacy scattered across the Caribbean seafloor. In the past 50 years, maritime archaeologists have located dozens of pirate-era shipwrecks, and each provides insights impossible to gain from written records alone. The Whydah excavation revealed fascinating details about daily life. Medical equipment suggested relatively sophisticated healthcare by 18th century standards. Weapons showed the variety pirates used, not just pistols and swords, but also blunderbusses and boarding axes. Personal items, crucifixes, rings, dice, even a shoe buckle inscribed with a name, humanized the crew. Blackbeard's Queen Anne's Revenge, discovered in 1996, yielded over 400,000 artifacts. Among them, medical equipment including urethral syringes for treating venereal disease, apothecary weights for measuring medicine, gold dust scattered in the sediment, and remarkably, cannons of various sizes and types, revealing how pirates armed their ships far beyond original specifications. These finds confirm some elements from written records while challenging others. The amount of personal wealth found on these ships is surprisingly modest. Most pirates weren't wealthy when they died. They'd spent their money exactly as testimony suggested. Archaeologists have also excavated pirate-era port cities. Port Royal, Jamaica, called the wickedest city on earth before an earthquake submerged most of it in 1692, has been partially excavated underwater. Findings reveal a thriving commercial center where legitimate and illegitimate trade mixed freely. The archaeological record confirms written descriptions of these pirate havens as chaotic, temporary places where fortunes changed overnight. Linguists have traced numerous English expressions back to pirate-era maritime slang. No quarter comes from the practice of granting or denying quarter to surrendered enemies. Pieces of 8 were Spanish reals, the most common currency in the Caribbean, often literally cut into 8 pieces for small change. Buccaneer derives from French bouca, a smoking grill used by Caribbean hunters. Freebooter comes from Dutch vrijboeder, meaning someone who freely takes booty, the origin of filibuster. 3 sheets to the wind refers to loose sails causing erratic movement, like a drunk person staggering. These phrases, now divorced from their maritime origins, show how pirate-era seafaring culture permeated broader language. Ironically, what we think of as pirate speech, the air midi stereotype, is almost entirely a 20th century Hollywood creation, particularly from actor Robert Newton's performance in the 1950 film of Treasure Island. Real pirates spoke in their native dialects and languages: English, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, various African languages, indigenous Caribbean languages, and maritime pidgin combinations of all of these. Pirates in fiction have undergone fascinating transformations, reflecting each era's values and anxieties. The Romantic era presented pirates as noble outcasts, victims of society's cruelty. The Victorian era saw them as adventurers in exotic locales, with Treasure Island presenting piracy as thrilling adventure suitable for boys' education. Mid-20th century swashbucklers like Errol Flynn fought tyranny and corrupt governors. Late 20th century works created comic anti-heroes and postmodern adventures. 21st century works like Pirates of the Caribbean present piracy as a dying way of life, being destroyed by corporate imperialism. Pirates as anti-capitalist folk heroes, which would have bewildered actual pirates who were themselves aggressive capitalists. Each generation reimagines pirates to fit contemporary concerns. Perhaps pirates' deepest legacy is philosophical. This was social contract theory in practice, implemented by men who'd never read philosophy. Elected captains, voting on major decisions, power distributed among officers. These practices appeared on pirate ships before appearing in European states. Equal pay for equal work, compensation for workplace injuries, right to participate in decisions affecting you, demands labor movements wouldn't win for over a century, existed on pirate ships. Pirates weren't implementing political philosophy. They were solving practical problems. You can't maintain a crew at sea through violence alone, so you need consent. You can't afford racial division when you need every hand in battle. You can't cheat people and expect them to fight for you. But by solving these practical problems, pirates demonstrated that alternate social arrangements were possible. Their experiments were brief and violent, but they proved something crucial: hierarchies based on birth rather than merit, racial exclusion, and unlimited autocratic power weren't natural or inevitable. Other arrangements could work. This is perhaps why authorities hanged pirates so publicly and brutally. Pirates threatened not just shipping, but the entire social order. If a multiracial crew could elect their captain and divide goods equally, what did that say about societies built on racial hierarchy and inherited privilege? These questions, once asked, never quite go away. That's the real treasure pirates left behind. Not gold buried on islands, but ideas scattered through the centuries, waiting to be discovered by anyone brave enough to ask, what if there's another way to live? And somewhere on old sea routes, when waves catch the light just right, when wind fills invisible sails, it's almost possible to imagine old flags rising again. Not as a threat, but as a reminder of just how complex their story was. They were not heroes, nor were they monsters. They were desperate, contradictory people, capable of both cruelty and justice. And it is this complex, living human story that will continue to capture our imagination.